Hello and welcome to episode 14 of the Millennium Pod, a Star Wars podcast by me, Ari, at ari.in.space on TikTok and at millenniumpod_ on Twitter and Instagram. So this week's topic is something that I have been thinking about and wanting to talk about for quite some time now. It was actually one of the original ideas I had, when I was starting this podcast. I still have a whole list of, topics I eventually want to get to. And this was one of the first ones. But I kept putting it off for no real reason. So this week I was like, I'm doing it. We're going to do it. And that is the theme of redemption in Star Wars. Now this is it's not really, well, it is a heavy topic, and there's a lot of debate around it, and I think ultimately there's no really right or wrong answer as to what constitutes redemption. And so for me in this episode, I'm going to kind of define it as how I see it personally. If you don't agree, that's totally fine. Because like I said, I don't really think there's black and white when it comes to redemption and atonement for evils or wrongdoings. I do think it depends on a lot of factors, and people are going to have different opinions based on their experiences. So, but yeah, this is how I feel about it. And I mean, we see in Star Wars, this is a big theme, or in whatever capacity it is. And so, but ultimately, I mean, the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy are, the ultimate goal is to redeem a character. And I mean, if you think about it, the prequels, while there is no specific redemption story, it's the fall story, but in that it's used again to set up this redemption. So really all of Star Wars is about redemption. But you know what, first let's just talk about some definitions before I get into kind of how I'm viewing this. First of all, the dictionary definition of the word redemption, which is kind of the word that is used when talking about these themes in Star Wars and other stories. That's the big word we always hear. And that definition is defined as the action of saving or being saved from sin, error, or evil. We'll leave that there for a second, and I want to move on to the second definition I want to talk about, which is atonement, which is less talked about in these themes of what I'm calling redemption, because that's kind of the buzzword we're using in these conversations. But I do think atonement is a huge part of that, and is a huge part of these stories, specifically in Star Wars, with Vader, Anakin, and Kylo Ren, Ben Solo. And anyway, atonement is defined by the dictionary as reparation for a wrong or injury. And it doesn't really specify what that reparation is, which again is why I think this is such a broad concept idea, the idea of redemption and atonement. Because again, they're very loosely defined, and I think people can kind of come up with their own definition for that. And I mean, I personally think you don't have one without the other, right? I mean, you can't really be saved from evil or wrongdoing without making some kind of reparation, and vice versa. When you make reparations for the evil that you have done, you are in turn saved in some sense from that evil. Before I get going much further, I guess I should mention, though I'm sure it's obvious, that the topic, or the characters that we're going to be talking about in this episode are, of course, going to be Vader / Anakin and Kylo Ren / Ben Solo, because they're really there's other redemption stories in Star Wars, but these are the big ones. And again, I'm using the term redemption loosely, kind of as this, more than just that definition I gave. It kind of is encompassing the idea that you also have to have some kind of atonement as well. So just from here on out, when I say redemption, I mean that theme of, righting wrongs, potentially being saved, kind of all of that in one. And I mean, based on those definitions I gave, I think, in my opinion, that Ben and Anakin both sort of do both of those things, but not completely. Because another thing that I think is important, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, in order to have true redemption, you need to have forgiveness from the people that that you have wronged. So yes, technically both Vader and Ren are saved, quote unquote, from evil. Like Vader literally says to Luke that he has saved him in Return of the Jedi. And which I believe is this evil in this case is the evil of the Sith. And similarly, though it isn't explicitly said in the same way, Rey saves Ben from, again, the evil of not really the Sith necessarily, but like the dark side. However, neither of these guys really has the forgiveness of all of those that they have wronged. So Rey and Luke have forgiven them. We as the audience have forgiven them. But nobody else in the galaxy has forgiven them. And I do think that it is important that if someone's going to be redeemed, as we describe it, they do need to have that forgiveness. So I guess basically, in my opinion, the definition for true redemption is, you're saved from this evil by making up for what you've done, atoning for what you've done, and then you've also gotten forgiveness. And I don't know if there's a word for all of those three things combined. So, once again, that's what I'm calling true redemption. And I don't really think that Anakin or Ben got that because, like I said, they weren't forgiven. So they had sort of quasi-redemption because they do fit those definitions, right? Both of them were saved from the evil that they were with, and they paid for their crimes with their lives. So they did atone. But again, they're missing that kind of key piece that I think would make it truly in what I think is redemption, which obviously isn't really what redemption is based on that definition. And to go off of that and kind of elaborate further, I think that although we all wish that Ben Solo could have lived, and I don't think that you need to die to be redeemed. I don't think that that's a necessity. There are other ways to atone. However, I truly believe that killing him off was the absolute nicest thing the writers could have done for that character. Because, imagine had he lived. I've heard rumors that there's footage that they filmed of him at the rebel camp or the resistance camp in the end celebrating with everybody. That makes no sense. Nobody would be wanting to celebrate with him, okay? I know we all love Ben Solo, the poor guy who was, just misunderstood, yada, yada, yada. We're not going to get into that. If you want to talk about Kylo Ren, Ben Solo, check out that podcast episode a few weeks back. But realistically, they would have hated him. The only person who really forgave him was Rey, and then the Force ghosts of Leia and Luke. And I think often as the audience, we forget that just because we see the villain redeemed in that sense, and this is again that half redeemed I'm talking about, because it's not full redemption because they aren't forgiven by everybody. Even though we see them redeemed and we accept it and we forgive them, the actual people in the Star Wars universe do not see it as we do. All they see are tyrannical mass murderers. The other beings of the galaxy do not get to be with us on Death Star 2. They don't get to see Vader chuck Palpatine down the reactor shaft. They don't get to be with us on Exegol. They don't see Ben give his life force to save Rey. And seeing is believing, people. Nobody's gonna... there's a part in some Star Wars book I was reading, I can't remember, it was probably Bloodline, where it was people just, they didn't believe that Vader actually, was the one who got rid of Palpatine. So, even though they've been told, they didn't believe it. And so, because these other beings in this galaxy don't get to witness the acts that create the redemption story, they can't forgive this person. And you can't blame them for not wanting to. Realistically, the only people who may have forgiven these guys, as in Vader and Kylo Ren, are Luke in the audience and Rey in the audience. And that's it. Even Leia says in Bloodline, which, by the way, is a very great book. If you've listened to any other episode, you've probably heard me plug this before. Great book. Read it. 12 out of 10. But even Leia says in Bloodline something along the lines of, Luke took comfort in knowing that Vader, in his last moments had become Anakin Skywalker. And that gave Luke comfort and peace. And Leia says, like, she's happy for Luke that he has that, but she can't bring herself to forgive Vader. And this is Leia, who loves Luke and would do anything for Luke, and you know, would obviously be upset she couldn't share in this with Luke, but she just can't. She can't agree with him. She can't agree with this, because when she thinks of Vader, all she knows is the pain and the literal torture he put her through. Like, she describes having, like, before Alderaan, in a scene that, I mean, we don't really see in the movie, but, you know, it's implied, her being laying on the floor in pain, being tortured, and Vader just standing there, right? So if Leia can't even agree with Luke, who she loves, like, how do we expect anyone else in the galaxy to be like, oh yeah, he, you know, enslaved a lot of people, murdered a lot of people, whatever, but it's fine because he did one good thing? No, like, that's just, it's not a thing. And that's, again, why I'm saying these guys have redemption in the eyes of the audience, but they don't really have true redemption because they don't have that forgiveness. And I mean, you can disagree with me. Maybe you don't think redemption needs forgiveness. That's totally fine. This is my opinion on this. And so I don't see it that way. And a big theme in Bloodline is Leia having to deal with people finding out that Vader is her biological father. And it's crazy and it's frustrating to read, because, I mean, this is like a minor spoiler of, like, the general plot, but nothing really specific, so if you want, this is your warning. But, I mean, anyway, Leia, you know, has done all this good for the rebellion, and then for building the New Republic. She's just, like, huge public figure, and in an instant, when people find out that Vader was her father, all her credibility is gone. Which just goes to show how much people hated him. And if they were so unwilling to even trust her, who never even knew him, just because she shared his blood, like, how can we expect them to forgive Vader and you know, to think of him in a good light? Like, history is never going to write Vader as, you know, the good guy in the end. That's never, like, you might have a few random articles on the HoloNet saying that, but, you know, for the vast majority of the galaxy, he is Space Hitler, okay? So there is no redemption for him in the eyes of them, because, again, they aren't there. They aren't with us. And I honestly the reason I get so excited about this and it's so interesting to me is because until I read Bloodline and realized how hated he was, I didn't realize it. You know, when you're the audience and, like I said, you're with them on Death Star 2, you're there for it, and you're like, especially when you've seen, you know, the prequels and you've seen Anakin before, and then knowing he becomes Anakin at the end, it's exciting as the audience, and we're happy for that. But we forget that only we have that perspective. I just think that's so interesting. And I mean, even there's a character in Bloodline who's I think one of the most interesting characters in Star Wars. I'm still not sure if he's a good guy or a bad guy, but I do think he's a very interesting character. And he loves the Empire. I was like, I don't want to say he loves the Empire, but he does in a way. Like, he has all this Empire paraphernalia, and he's from the political party in the New Republic that kind of leans towards, you know, more control over everything. And he, as much as he doesn't like the Emperor and, you know, like a single dictator, he does think that the Empire and, you know, having some semblance of control is good. Which, again, you know, that echoes Anakin's words in the prequels, which is why I'm like, I don't know if he's a good character or a bad character. But even this guy, Ransom Casterfo is his name, he liked the Empire, but he hated Vader. And I want to share this quote from this character, Ransom, who is an Empire somewhat sympathizer, who does hate Vader, and this is just his perspective years later, like 30-ish years later, after Death Star 2, the Return of the Jedi events. You know, he was just a kid during that war, now he's like, again, like 30-something, whatever. All these years later, this is still something that resonates with him. Anyway, I'm just gonna read the quote, and then and then talk about it here in a second. So, quote, "The high stone walls surrounding the labor camp, air thick with soot and smoke from the factory chimneys, Ransom's small hands raw and chapped from polishing the blaster casings, the stink of chemicals absorbed into his skin, hunger clawing inside his belly, his father trying to explain to Lord Vader the impossibility of the quota set for them, the harsh metallic breathing, the mortal terror that made Ransom vomit right there on the floor, and he thought that was it. For sure, now Vader would kill him. But Vader didn't care about a small boy's fear. He only cared about the quotas. His hand around Papa's throat, the way he made Ransom watch his father gasp and gag and plead, how Vader had thrown Papa down like trash. How he had hated Vader then." Unquote. And that's just like from the perspective, it's written in the third person, but we're getting his thoughts. So it's Ransom's thoughts, remembering Vader and how it was. And so if somebody who could sympathize with the Empire and, say, oh, well, some of the things they did were for the greater good, but could not forgive Vader, I mean, how is there hope for anybody else to be forgiving him? And that is why, all of this to say why I do think that, as much as people wanted Ben Solo to live, there's just no way. He would have spent, like I said, the nicest thing that the writers did was killing him off at the end. Because he would have spent his entire life either in exile somewhere, if he managed to escape, or in jail. I mean, and he also would have had to have lived with all of the horrible things he'd done. And I mean, yes, is death the easy way out when you're writing a redemption story? Absolutely. But I mean, when people say, hashtag Ben Solo deserved better, I think he got the best. Like, he would have been alive, but he would have been suffering immensely. I mean, you look at in the MCU, and I assume, which I might be incorrect in assuming, but I assume if you're listening to a Star Wars podcast, you probably also like Marvel, because in my experience, those who like one usually like the other to some extent. But anyway, you think about someone like the Winter Soldier, Bucky Barnes, who did all these horrible things that he had no control over, and the remorse he feels for things he couldn't even control. Now imagine that remorse, but like amped up to 1,000 in Ben Solo, because, he did have control for the most part. I mean, yes, again, visit my Kylo Ren episode. I had some great guests on. We talked a lot about this. Was it entirely his fault? No, but he did have free will the entire time. Like, no one was brainwashing him into doing things. Was he strongly manipulated and influenced? Yes, but it was his own doing. And so if somebody like, Bucky, the Winter Soldier, has such, remorse for things he literally had no control over whatsoever. Like, again, imagine that for Ben Solo, but again, like amped up to 50,000. And I mean, I genuinely like Ben Solo, right? And I mean, while I think seeing him work through stuff would have been totally awesome, at the same time, I also don't want to see him suffer. And I think that's why his death is okay with me, because now he's just, he's just at peace, right? Like, it's the, like I say, like, there's no way anyone would have forgiven him, because he committed as many crimes as Vader, and we although we don't have evidence, because we don't have really any post-sequel material, with, how people are remembering Kylo Ren, remembering Ben Solo, we do have that evidence of how people remember Vader, and it's not in a good light. It's not in a good light, and history does repeat itself, so why would how people remember Kylo Ren be any different than how they remember Vader? So all of this to say, going back to like my original definition, do I think that Ben Solo and Anakin Skywalker were redeemed in the sense of the definition? Yes, they were saved from evil. And do I think that they atoned for what they did? In a way, yes, with their lives. Do I think they're fully redeemed in the eyes of the galaxy? No, absolutely not. Because once again, I think you need forgiveness in order to be fully redeemed, and they don't have that, and they never will have that. And had they lived, I don't really think they ever would have been able to fully atone for all the wrongs they did or been fully forgiven. So, I mean, it's kind of a moot point to be like, oh, I wish they lived. Well, their life would have kind of sucked. Again, going back to killing them is the kindest thing ever. Is it? Well, I'm not going to say it's a lazy way of writing because I'm not a writer, so I'm not going to go out here and be like, that was lazy. No, because it wasn't. Is it the easy way out in writing a redemption story? Yes. Yes, it is. I said that already. But again, I think it was a nice thing to do. And I mean, like I said, like, I don't know. Yeah, had they lived, I really don't think they could have ever been fully, redeemed and people not hated them. Because when you do that much bad, I don't really think you can ever be fully redeemed in the eyes of others in history. But then again, this is where, it gets kind of interesting, because where is that line, right? Because someone like Callus in Rebels, I do believe is much closer to full redemption, as full as you can get. And I mean, we can assume that as a high-ranking Imperial, he too did some terrible things. Probably not to the extent of Vader and Kylo, but I mean, still pretty terrible. So, like, where is the line where it's like, oh, you've gone too far, you can never be fully forgiven and redeemed? I don't know. I don't really think there's a correct answer. And I think about this a lot, and I change my opinion on it a lot. So, I'm always interested to talk about this and think about it. So, I mean, all this to say, to reiterate one final time, based on my own personal definitions, Ben Solo and Anakin Skywalker, are they redeemed? Yes, in the eyes of the audience. No, not really in the eyes of everybody else in the actual universe, in the actual story. So I guess they're half redeemed. Because again, I mean, they are saved and they do pay the price, but I really think to get that full redemption, you need that forgiveness, even though it's not really part of the dictionary definitions. That's how I see it. So, half redeemed, I guess. Yeah, we'll go with they're half redeemed. But yeah, that's all my thoughts, really. It was a big ramble, but this is just such an interesting discussion, especially since it is such a big theme in Star Wars, especially. Yeah, we're always seeing these themes, so I just think it's so interesting. But that is all I have to say on this topic. So thank you so much for listening. If you're still here after almost 23 minutes of me babbling away, my own opinion. This was a very strong opinion piece today. But yeah, thank you for listening. I truly so appreciate it. I can't believe people actually want to listen to this to me. But it's cool. I love it. So thank you for, giving me an excuse to ramble with Star Wars. Anyway, I hope that everyone is having a great day, night, morning, evening, whatever it is, wherever you are listening. And as always, please feel free to reach out to me on social media. I mentioned them right at the beginning. They will also be linked in the description. Yeah, I would love to hear from you. Unless you're going to be mean, then I don't really want to hear from you if you're going to be mean. But yeah, thanks again. And as always, may the Force be with you.